April 11, 1970, Kennedy Space Center, Florida. A Saturday afternoon bathed in brilliant sunshine and the confidence of a nation that had conquered the moon. Three men sat strapped inside Apollo 13, perched atop a Saturn V rocket that stood 36 stories tall and weighed more than 6 million pounds when fully fueled. Commander James Lovell, 42 years old, a veteran of 3 previous spaceflights including Apollo 8's historic orbit of the moon. Calm, experienced, unshakable. Command Module pilot Jack Swigert, 38, a last-minute replacement who had joined the crew just 48 hours earlier after Ken Mattingly was exposed to measles. Lunar Module pilot Fred Haise, 36, making his first spaceflight but trained to perfection, eager to walk on the moon in the Fra Mauro Highlands. The mission plan was ambitious but routine by NASA's standards. Land in Fra Mauro, deploy scientific experiments, collect samples, return home as heroes number 7 and 8.
Before we continue with this mysterious truth, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment at the end.
Launch time, 2:13 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The countdown proceeded without drama, each milestone clicking past like clockwork built by the best engineers on Earth. Television cameras positioned around the launch pad captured every angle, but America had largely stopped watching. Moon shots had become almost boring to the public. Apollo 11 had landed Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin 10 months earlier, fulfilling Kennedy's promise. Apollo 12 followed 4 months later, proving it wasn't just luck. The networks barely covered Apollo 13's launch. Most Americans spent that Saturday doing yard work, watching sports, living their lives without looking up at the sky. Inside Mission Control in Houston, Texas, Flight Director Gene Kranz sat at his console, monitoring hundreds of data streams from the spacecraft and ground systems. Kranz was a former fighter pilot with a crew-cut, steely blue eyes and a collection of vests his wife made for each mission. For Apollo 13, he wore white. Every number on every screen showed nominal, that beautiful word engineers loved, meaning everything was exactly as it should be, perfect within acceptable parameters. The Saturn V ignited precisely on schedule, its 5 F1 engines generating 7.6 million pounds of thrust, consuming 15 tons of fuel per second at full power. The ground shook for miles in every direction. Birds flew from trees, windows rattled in buildings. The rocket climbed slowly at first, fighting gravity with pure force. Stage 1 burned for 2 minutes and 41 seconds, pushing the spacecraft to 42 miles altitude and 6,000 miles per hour before separating cleanly. Stage 2 ignited instantly, 6 J2 engines burning liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, accelerating the crew faster and higher into the thinning atmosphere above. Stage 3 fired briefly to achieve Earth orbit, then shut down. Apollo 13 circled the planet once while the crew performed system checks and prepared for departure. The crew went through hundreds of checklist items, verifying every system, every switch, every gauge. Lovell's voice was steady, professional, the sound of total competence. Swigert, still getting used to the spacecraft after his rushed training, performed flawlessly. Haise monitored the lunar module systems, checking his future landing vehicle. 2 hours and 35 minutes after launch, Mission Control gave the order for trans-lunar injection. Stage 3 reignited for the final time, the big push. For 5 minutes and 48 seconds, the J2 engine burned, accelerating Apollo 13 to 24,500 miles per hour, fast enough to escape Earth's gravitational grip completely. The crew felt themselves pushed deep into their seats as the rocket accelerated, the invisible hand of thrust pressing them backward, their bodies suddenly heavy. When the engine cut off, they were traveling faster than any humans in history except the previous Apollo crews, committed to a 250,000-mile journey. Swigert performed the transposition and docking maneuver with textbook precision, separating the command module from the spent third stage and turning around in space. He carefully docked with the lunar module still housed in its protective adapter, extracted it like pulling a sword from a sheath, then backed away from the rocket. The combined Apollo spacecraft, now in its lunar configuration, drifted away from the SIVB stage, which would continue on its own trajectory to crash into the moon. The crew settled into the rhythm of spaceflight, that strange routine of floating, eating, working, sleeping, while traveling through the most hostile environment humans had ever entered. Day 1 passed smoothly with only minor housekeeping tasks. Day 2 brought a few small anomalies, nothing that concerned anyone in Houston or aboard the spacecraft. The crew performed a scheduled television broadcast, showing viewers back on Earth what life looked like in zero gravity, demonstrating how they prepared food and moved around. Lovell gave a tour of the spacecraft interior, pointing out equipment and explaining systems. Haise joked about floating and did somersaults for the camera. But the networks didn't carry it live. Only a few stations picked up the feed for delayed broadcast. America had moved on from the moon, at least for now. On Earth, families went about their weekend routines. In Houston, Mission Control worked in 3 shifts around the clock, monitoring, calculating, watching every number. In space, 3 men floated through a metal tube, traveling 25,000 miles per hour through absolute vacuum toward a distant gray sphere pulling them closer. Oxygen Tank 2, mounted in the service module behind the command module, had been manufactured by Beech Aircraft Corporation under contract to North American Rockwell. Inside that tank, liquid oxygen sat at -297 degrees Fahrenheit, kept at high pressure, providing both breathing air and reactant for the fuel cells that generated power. The tank contained thermostatic switches, heaters to maintain temperature, quantity probes to measure how much oxygen remained, and motorized fans to stir the liquid. 2 years earlier, during ground testing, that tank had been filled and then ordered emptied, but it wouldn't drain properly due to a faulty fill tube.
Now we're taking a short break here. In the meantime, if you haven't subscribed yet, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and give the video a like.
Technicians decided to boil off the liquid oxygen using the internal heaters, which should have been a routine procedure taking hours to complete safely. But the thermostatic switches in the heater circuit had been manufactured for 28-volt DC power, then later installed in a spacecraft system using 65-volt DC power. When the high voltage ran through the switches during the boil-off procedure, the contacts welded shut, rendering them unable to cut off power to the heaters. The heaters ran far hotter than designed, potentially reaching 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, but the temperature sensors only read up to 80 degrees, so nobody noticed. The extreme heat damaged the Teflon insulation on wires inside the tank, making them brittle, degrading them invisibly over time, creating a bomb waiting to explode. NASA's quality control processes, normally exhaustive, missed this problem. The tank was certified as flight-ready and installed in the service module of Apollo 13. For 55 hours and 53 minutes of the mission, that damaged tank sat dormant, pressurized, cold, waiting for the wrong combination of circumstances. April 13, 1970. Mission elapsed time, 55 hours, 54 minutes, 53 seconds. Apollo 13 was 199,995 miles from Earth, still accelerating toward the moon. The crew had just finished a live television broadcast that lasted 49 minutes, showing off the lunar module interior and demonstrating zero-gravity maneuvers. Only a handful of television stations had aired the broadcast. Most of America was watching other programming, unaware that history was being made above them. 9 minutes after the broadcast ended, Jack Swigert was working through a routine housekeeping checklist, one of dozens of procedures performed daily in space. Item number 15 on the list: stir the cryogenic oxygen tanks to prevent stratification, keeping the liquid oxygen properly mixed for accurate quantity readings. These tanks, designated Oxygen Tank 1 and Oxygen Tank 2, were mounted in Sector 4 of the service module, that cylindrical section behind the command module cabin. They supplied breathing oxygen for the crew and provided reactant for the 3 fuel cells that generated all electrical power for the command and service modules. Swigert reached for the switch labeled O2 tanks, positioned it to the FANS setting, and activated the stirring fans inside both tanks simultaneously. Inside Oxygen Tank 2, electric motors began spinning fans through the supercooled liquid, a routine operation performed dozens of times during every Apollo mission. But this time, the damaged wire insulation inside the tank, degraded by the overheating incident 2 years earlier, finally failed catastrophically. A spark jumped through the damaged insulation, igniting the Teflon coating in the pure oxygen environment. The fire spread instantly through the tank's interior. The pressure inside the tank spiked beyond design limits in milliseconds. The tank ruptured explosively, tearing open the service module's outer skin like paper. 2 seconds after Swigert flipped the switch, all 3 crew members heard and felt a loud bang that shook the entire spacecraft violently, like being inside a struck bell. Warning lights blazed across the instrument panels in front of them. Master alarm klaxons sounded. The crew's training kicked in instantly, scanning instruments, calling out readings. Swigert's voice came across the radio to Houston, calm and professional despite the adrenaline surely flooding his system. "Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here." Flight Director Gene Kranz, seated at his console in Mission Control's second row, immediately responded, "This is Houston. Say again, please." Lovell came on the radio, his voice carrying slightly more urgency. "Houston, we've had a problem. We've had a main B bus undervolt." The main B bus was one of 2 primary electrical distribution systems. An undervolt meant power was dropping, which meant something was seriously wrong with the fuel cells. Swigert added more information as he scanned his instruments, and we had a pretty large bang associated with the caution and warning there. In Mission Control, Electrical, Environmental, and Consumables Manager Seymour Lieberget, known as AECOM, watched his screen flood with contradictory data. Voltages dropping on multiple systems, pressures fluctuating wildly, current readings jumping. Nothing made immediate sense, too many things going wrong simultaneously. Gene Kranz immediately ordered all controllers to freeze their consoles, locking the data displays so they could analyze what happened without losing the critical readings. "Okay, everybody, let's think this through," Kranz said over the control room's voice loop. "I want you to go into your procedures and start isolating the problem." Lovell unbuckled from his seat and floated to the left-hand window of the command module, looking back along the exterior of the spacecraft toward the service module. What he saw made his blood run cold. A cloud of gas was venting from the spacecraft, streaming out into space, visible in the sunlight as a crystalline fog. "We are venting something out into space," Lovell reported to Houston, trying to keep his voice steady while his mind raced through the implications of that statement. The automatic control system was firing thrusters constantly now, trying to counteract the force of the venting gas pushing the spacecraft off its precise trajectory. Inside Mission Control, the trajectory specialists watched their displays showing Apollo 13 beginning to drift, its orientation changing as the escaping gas acted like an unplanned thruster. Lieberget studied his telemetry screens, watching oxygen tank 2 pressure drop towards 0. The tank was gone, ruptured, empty, but the data showed something worse. Oxygen tank 1 pressure was falling too, not explosively like tank 2, but steadily declining, which meant it was leaking, probably damaged by debris from the explosion. The fuel cells, which combined hydrogen and oxygen to produce electricity and drinking water, began failing one by one as their oxygen supply disappeared. Fuel cell 3 went offline first, then fuel cell 1 shut down. Fuel cell 2 struggled along but was consuming the last oxygen from tank 1 at an unsustainable rate. Within minutes, the entire picture became clear to the engineers in Houston. The command and service module was dying, bleeding out its life support into space. Gene Kranz stood at his console, his jaw set, his mind running through options and finding no good ones, only less terrible ones, choices between bad and worse. The command module had batteries, but they were meant only for re-entry, to power the spacecraft for the final 3 hours when the service module would be jettisoned. If they used the batteries now, they'd have nothing left for coming home. But if they didn't use them, the command module would go completely dead in hours. Lovell, Swigert, and Haise floated in their crippled spacecraft, 200,000 miles from Earth, watching their instruments tell them they were running out of time. The mathematics of spaceflight suddenly became their enemy. They couldn't turn around. They didn't have enough fuel to reverse course and come straight home. They would have to continue around the moon, using its gravity to slingshot them back toward Earth, a path that would take 4 more days, maybe 5. But the oxygen would be gone in 2 hours. The power would die, the cabin would freeze, they would suffocate in the dark, their bodies orbiting forever. Unless the engineers found a solution that didn't exist yet, 3 American astronauts were going to die in space, and Mission Control was going to watch it happen. Gene Kranz stood up at his console, his white vest catching the fluorescent lights of Mission Control, and made a decision that would either save 3 lives or simply prolong the dying. "We're going to power down the command module and use the lunar module as a lifeboat," he announced to his team, his voice cutting through the controlled chaos. The idea was radical but simple. Odyssey, the command module, would die within hours, but Aquarius, the lunar module still attached to the spacecraft, had its own power. The lunar module was designed to take 2 astronauts from lunar orbit down to the surface, keep them alive for 2 days, then return them to orbit for docking. It had its own oxygen tanks, its own batteries, its own environmental control system, its own descent engine for propulsion. It was a complete self-contained spacecraft. But it was designed for 2 men for 2 days on a moon landing. Could it keep 3 men alive for 4 days on an emergency return to Earth? The engineers started calculating immediately, pulling out technical manuals, running numbers on their slide rules, checking consumables margins against mission time. Oxygen, the lunar module had enough for 3 men for 4 days, barely, with no margin for error or leaks or unexpected consumption. Power, the batteries would be drained to absolute zero by re-entry time, assuming they rationed every amp, turned off every non-essential system, lived in the dark and cold. Water, critically short, needed for cooling the electronics and drinking, would have to be rationed to ounces per person per day, below the threshold of dehydration. Lithium hydroxide, the chemical that scrubbed carbon dioxide from the air, would run out, and the lunar module's canisters wouldn't fit the command module's life support system. Every consumable was calculated down to the hour, the minute, the gram. Everything was critically short, but it was their only option, so it had to work. Kranz turned to his team. "Work the problem, people. I don't care what it was designed to do. I care about what it can do. Get me solutions." In space, Lovell made the decision to move the crew into Aquarius. They began the delicate process of powering down Odyssey while activating the lunar module. This was a procedure that had never been planned, never trained, never simulated. The lunar module was supposed to be activated in lunar orbit, not during an emergency. The crew floated through the narrow docking tunnel connecting the command module to the lunar module, entering the cramped cabin designed for 2 men in spacesuits. Aquarius was all sharp angles and exposed systems, built with walls as thin as aluminum foil to save weight, never meant to operate in deep space for days. Haise, the lunar module pilot, began reading through activation checklists while Houston transmitted new procedures, writing them on the fly, adapting to the emergency. They powered up the guidance computer, initialized the platform that told them their orientation in space, activated life support, turned on communication systems. Every switch throw was critical. Every procedure had to be perfect. One mistake could make things worse, could turn their lifeboat into another death trap. In Houston, dozens of engineers crowded into back rooms, working parallel problems simultaneously, calculating trajectories, power budgets, consumables, abort options. The guidance, navigation, and control team plotted courses. The trajectory specialists calculated engine burns. The flight dynamics officers computed orbital mechanics. The most immediate question: could they turn around and come straight home, burning the lunar module's descent engine hard to reverse their velocity and head back? The answer came back quickly: no. They were traveling too fast, too far from Earth. Reversing course would require more fuel than the lunar module carried. They would have to continue around the moon, letting its gravity bend their trajectory back toward Earth, a path called a free return trajectory. But even that wasn't simple anymore. The explosion had knocked them off the standard free return path. Their current trajectory would miss Earth by tens of thousands of miles. They would fly past the planet and continue into deep space, their frozen bodies orbiting the sun forever, a tomb in the void. Another engine burn would be required to correct their trajectory. using the lunar module's descent engine to nudge them back onto a path that would intersect Earth. But when and how much? The calculations required precise knowledge of their current velocity, position, and heading, all of which were uncertain after the explosion. The guidance platform in the command module had been tumbling during the crisis. Its internal gyroscopes, which maintained spatial orientation, might have lost their reference frame. If the platform was misaligned, any burn they attempted would push them in the wrong direction, potentially making things worse, sending them further off course. Lovell would have to realign the platform manually, using a sextant to sight on stars and the sun, calculating their orientation the way mariners had navigated oceans for centuries. This normally took hours of careful measurements and calculations. Lovell had minutes. He worked with intense focus, his hands steady despite exhaustion and adrenaline. In mission control, Flight Dynamics Officer Jerry Bostick worked with his team to calculate the correction burn parameters, running and rerunning the numbers for accuracy. They needed to fire the descent engine for exactly the right duration, at exactly the right time, pointed in exactly the right direction, or the crew would die. The descent engine had never been fired while the lunar module was still attached to the service module and dead command module, creating an unbalanced, ungainly stack. Engineers worried the engine might not gimbal correctly with 3 times its design mass to push. If it fired off-axis, the spacecraft could tumble uncontrollably. But they had no choice. The burn had to happen. Lovell would have to fire the engine and manually compensate if anything went wrong, flying by instinct and experience. The crew was exhausted, cold, running on pure adrenaline and training. They'd been awake for over 20 hours dealing with one crisis after another without rest. Swigert remained in Odyssey, monitoring the dying command module systems, ready to shut down anything that might drain the precious batteries needed for re-entry. Haise and Lovell worked in Aquarius, configuring systems, checking pressures, preparing the descent engine for a burn it was never designed to perform. Outside, the venting from the damaged service module had finally stopped. The oxygen tanks were completely empty. The gas cloud dissipated into infinite space. The spacecraft drifted through the void, off course and crippled, its crew fighting against physics and time with nothing but their training, their courage, and mission control's genius. 61 hours and 29 minutes into the mission, 5 hours and 35 minutes after the explosion, Apollo 13 prepared for the first critical engine burn. This was called the PC+2 burn, meaning parasynthion plus 2 hours, a correction to be made 2 hours after their closest approach to the moon's far side. The goal was simple to state but terrifying to execute. Fire the lunar module's descent engine for 35 seconds to speed up their return home by 10 hours. 10 hours meant the difference between having enough consumables to survive and suffocating in the dark, freezing to death while still breathing, dying by inches. Gene Kranz's team had run the calculations dozens of times, checking and rechecking, because there would be no second chance, no do-over if they got it wrong. Lovell completed the platform alignment, confirming their orientation in space using star sightings. The guidance computer now knew which way was up, which way was forward. The crew configured Aquarius for the burn, securing loose equipment, positioning themselves, running through checklists while Houston transmitted last-minute updates. At 61 hours and 30 minutes, Apollo 13 disappeared behind the moon, passing into the radio shadow where no transmission could reach Earth. All communication ceased instantly. The crew was completely alone, cut off from mission control on the far side of the moon where no human had ever been in distress. For 35 minutes they would be out of contact, unable to hear Houston's guidance, unable to report problems, flying blind through the most critical maneuvers. Lovell looked out the window at the lunar surface passing below, the craters and mountains where he and Haise should have been landing, the science they would never do. From Morrow, their target landing site slid past beneath them, gray and ancient and utterly indifferent to the human drama playing out in the metal can overhead. This was Lovell's second trip around the moon. He'd orbited it with Apollo 8 during Christmas 1968, the first humans to see the far side with their own eyes. He'd been scheduled to command Apollo 14, but the crew rotation had moved him to Apollo 13. Now he wondered if that shuffle had been fate or simply terrible luck. The spacecraft emerged from behind the moon precisely on schedule, right when Houston calculated it would reappear, a small victory of mathematics over chaos. "Hello, Houston, this is Aquarius," Lovell's voice crackled through the speakers in mission control. "We're ready for the burn." Controllers leaned forward at their consoles. In the viewing gallery above the control room, NASA officials and engineers stood motionless, barely breathing. Lovell took manual control of the spacecraft, his hand on the attitude controller, ready to compensate if the engine burned off-center and started them tumbling. At the precise moment calculated by Houston, he pushed the throttle forward to 40% power. The descent engine ignited, pushing the crew back into their seats. The engine burned perfectly, the spacecraft holding steady despite the unbalanced mass it was pushing through space. Lovell's hand barely moved on the controller. 35 seconds felt like 35 years. The crew counted down, watching the clock, feeling the thrust, praying the engine wouldn't fail or explode or push them wrong. At exactly 35 seconds, Lovell shut down the engine. The sudden silence was profound. The spacecraft coasted, no longer under power, just momentum now. "Houston, burn complete," Lovell reported, his voice betraying no emotion, pure professional pilot reporting facts to ground control. The trajectory team ran their calculations, analyzing the telemetry from the burn, computing Apollo 13's new path through space based on the velocity change. Flight Dynamics Officer Jerry Bostick smiled for the first time in 6 hours. "Flight trajectory confirms we're on a course for Earth intercept." They had bought themselves 10 hours, cutting their total mission time to approximately 142 hours, landing in the Pacific Ocean on April 17 if everything went right. But everything wouldn't go right. There were still 3.5 days ahead, 70+ hours in a dying spacecraft with margins so thin they didn't exist. The temperature inside Aquarius began dropping immediately. With minimal power available, the heaters were shut off to conserve electricity for critical systems. The cabin temperature fell to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, then 45, approaching the point where condensation would form on every surface, potentially shorting electronics. The crew wore their flight suits, but even those weren't designed for prolonged cold exposure. They began shivering, their breath visible in the freezing air. Water was rationed to 6 ounces per person per day, less than a quarter of normal consumption, below the threshold where the body begins shutting down from dehydration. Food became irrelevant. No one felt like eating in the cold and stress. They forced down a few bites occasionally, more out of discipline than hunger. Sleep became impossible. The cold prevented deep sleep, and someone always needed to be awake monitoring systems, making adjustments, checking consumables. In Houston, the engineers worked around the clock in shifts, but many stayed at their consoles 20 hours straight, running calculations, developing procedures. Contractors and subcontractors from across the aerospace industry sent engineers to mission control to help. Grumman, who built the Lunar module, sent their best people. North American Rockwell, who built the command module, contributed engineers who knew every system intimately. Everyone was working the problem simultaneously. The phrase "failure is not an option" was never actually spoken during Apollo 13, but the sentiment permeated every decision, every calculation, every procedure. Meanwhile, the carbon dioxide problem loomed larger with every breath the crew took. Humans exhale CO2, which becomes poisonous in enclosed spaces if not removed. The Lunar module had lithium hydroxide canisters that chemically absorbed carbon dioxide from the air, but those canisters were designed for 2 men for 2 days. With 3 men for 4 days, the canisters would be exhausted within hours, and the CO2 level would rise to lethal concentrations, poisoning the crew in their sleep. The command module had plenty of lithium hydroxide canisters, stowed useless in the dead Odyssey, but they were square and the Lunar module's receptacles were round. Engineers in Houston retreated to a conference room with a box containing only materials available on the spacecraft: plastic bags, cardboard, tape, socks, flight manuals. They had to design an adapter using these random materials that would allow the square command module canisters to work in the lunar module's round receptacles. Within hours, they had a solution, a strange contraption that looked like it belonged in a junkyard but would save 3 lives if it worked. The procedure was transmitted to the crew. Take a plastic bag, cut out this part, tape it here, use the cover of your flight manual as a base, secure with that. Lovell, Swigert, and Haise followed the instructions, building their improvised life support adapter with numbed fingers in the freezing cabin, working by flashlight. The contraption looked absurd, but when they turned it on and monitored the CO2 sensors, the levels began dropping. The improvised adapter worked perfectly. That small victory bought them more time, but every hour brought new problems, new emergencies, new impossible challenges that had to be solved with whatever was available. 79 hours into the mission, Apollo 13 was 35,000 miles past the moon, climbing out of its gravity well, falling toward Earth under the sun's gravity. The crew had been in the lunar module for 17 hours, shivering in temperatures that continued dropping, now hovering around 40 degrees Fahrenheit inside the cabin. Condensation formed on every metal surface, dripping from the walls, the instruments, the windows. Water droplets floated through the air, impossible to wipe away completely. The droplets threatened to short-circuit the electrical systems, keeping them alive, but there was nothing they could do except wipe surfaces occasionally and hope. Swigert developed a urinary tract infection, likely from dehydration, painful and distracting, but not life-threatening if it didn't get worse over the next days. Haise developed a fever, his temperature rising above normal, his body fighting something, maybe an infection, maybe just the stress and cold breaking down his immune system. Lovell stayed focused, monitoring systems, checking calculations, working through procedures, refusing to acknowledge his own exhaustion and the pain in his shoulders from the cold. In Houston, the engineers calculated another problem. Apollo 13's current trajectory would bring them into Earth's atmosphere at too shallow an angle. If the re-entry angle was too shallow, they would skip off the atmosphere like a stone skipping on water, bouncing back into space with no way to return. If the angle was too steep, they would burn up from friction, the heat shield unable to dissipate the energy fast enough, the crew killed by fire instead of cold. The safe corridor was narrow, just a few degrees wide, threading a needle from 250,000 miles away while traveling 25,000 miles per hour. Another correction burn would be required, using the lunar module's descent engine one more time to adjust their trajectory to hit that narrow re-entry corridor. This burn, scheduled for 105 hours into the mission, was called the PC+2 supplemental burn, a fine-tuning of their course based on tracking data from Earth. But first, they needed more precise trajectory information. The tracking stations on Earth could only measure so accurately from such great distances. The crew performed a manual starsight alignment, using the sextant and specific stars to calculate their exact position and velocity, feeding data to Houston's computers. The calculations came back confirming what the engineers feared. Without another burn, they would miss the re-entry corridor and skip off the atmosphere into deep space. The supplemental burn had to be perfect, just 14 seconds of engine firing to nudge their velocity by a few feet per second, barely perceptible but absolutely critical. At 105 hours and 18 minutes, with the crew positioned and ready, Lovell fired the descent engine for exactly 14 seconds, then shut it down. The trajectory team analyzed the telemetry and confirmed. Apollo 13 was now aimed at the center of the re-entry corridor, with margins so thin they barely existed. But they were on target. If nothing else went wrong, they would hit Earth's atmosphere at the correct angle and survive re-entry. That was a very big if. The spacecraft continued its long coast toward Earth, covering thousands of miles per hour, seeming to crawl from the perspective of the crew trapped inside. Time became elastic, stretching and compressing. Hours felt like days, minutes felt like seconds. The crew existed in a timeless state of exhausted vigilance. They talked occasionally, sharing memories, discussing the mission, wondering what had caused the explosion, but mostly they worked in silence, conserving energy and breath. Mission Control maintained constant contact, talking them through procedures, providing updates, just being present on the radio so the crew knew they weren't alone. The capsule communicator, or CAPCOM, was always an astronaut, someone who understood spaceflight intimately, could speak the language, could reassure without sugarcoating. Ken Mattingly, the command module pilot originally assigned to Apollo 13 before being scrubbed for measles exposure, worked around the clock helping develop procedures. Mattingly spent hours in the command module simulator at Kennedy Space Center, testing power-up sequences for re-entry, finding the minimum power path to survival. The command module had to be powered back up before re-entry, but the batteries had limited capacity, and every system that turned on drained precious amps. Mattingly tested procedure after procedure, finding which systems could stay off longer, which ones needed priority, how to squeeze 3 hours of operation from 2 hours of battery. He transmitted his procedures to Houston, which refined them and transmitted them to Apollo 13, pages and pages of switch positions and timing sequences. The crew copied down the procedures by hand, writing in the dim light, filling pages in their flight data files with the choreography that might save their lives. Meanwhile, recovery forces began positioning in the Pacific Ocean, calculating impact coordinates, moving ships into place to retrieve the crew within minutes of splashdown. The USS Iwo Jima, an aircraft carrier, steamed toward the predicted landing area, its crew preparing for a recovery operation that would be watched by the entire world. Navy divers trained for the retrieval, reviewing procedures, checking equipment, ready to jump from helicopters into the ocean to secure the command module. Back in space, Apollo 13 crossed the halfway point, closer to Earth now than to the Moon, falling faster as Earth's gravity became the dominant force on their trajectory. At 134 hours into the mission, with 8 hours remaining until re-entry, the crew began final preparations, organizing equipment, securing anything that might float loose. The service module would have to be jettisoned before re-entry, separated and allowed to burn up in the atmosphere, taking its evidence of the explosion to fiery destruction. But before that happened, NASA wanted photographs of the damage, visual evidence of what had happened, documentation for the investigation that would surely follow. At 138 hours into the mission, with 4 hours until re-entry, the crew fired the pyrotechnic bolts that connected the service module to the command module. Springs pushed the service module away gently, and for the first time since the explosion, the crew could see the full extent of the damage to their spacecraft. Lovell maneuvered Aquarius to give them a view, and what they saw was shocking. An entire panel on the service module's exterior was blown away completely. Interior equipment hung out into space, frozen and damaged. The tanks and systems that should have brought them home were twisted wreckage glinting in the sunlight. "Okay, Houston," Lovell reported, his voice quiet with the realization of how close they'd come to complete destruction. "We're getting pictures. There's one whole side of the spacecraft missing." The extent of the damage made it miraculous they'd survived this long. If the explosion had been slightly different, slightly larger, they would have died instantly. Houston acknowledged the report, and the service module drifted away, tumbling slowly, a piece of space junk that would orbit Earth for years before eventually decaying. Now only 2 pieces remained. Aquarius, the lunar module that had kept them alive, and Odyssey, the command module that had to bring them through re-entry. 142 hours into the mission, with 2 hours until re-entry, the crew faced their final challenge, powering up Odyssey and abandoning Aquarius before hitting the atmosphere. The command module had been essentially dead for 3 days, cold-soaked to near-freezing temperatures, its systems dormant to preserve the batteries for these final hours. Mattingly's procedures, developed through hours of simulator testing, outlined exactly how to bring Odyssey back to life using the minimum possible power. Every switch had to be thrown in the correct sequence, at the correct time, to avoid overloading circuits or draining the batteries before re-entry was complete. The crew began transferring essential equipment from Aquarius back to Odyssey: flight data files, sample containers, cameras, anything they needed to bring home. Swigert floated into the command module first, shivering in the freezing cabin, his breath fogging in the air, water condensation dripping from every surface inside. He began throwing switches according to Mattingly's procedures, bringing up systems one by one, watching voltage readouts, ensuring nothing drew too much current too soon. The guidance platform had to be aligned again because it had been shut down and had lost its reference frame during the 3 days of dormancy in space. Lovell transferred the alignment data from Aquarius to Odyssey manually, copying numbers from one guidance computer to the other, double-checking every digit for accuracy. One wrong number in the alignment would send them tumbling during re-entry, disorienting the guidance system, potentially causing them to miss the landing zone entirely. Haise remained in Aquarius, monitoring its systems during the final minutes, making sure their lifeboat stayed alive until the last possible moment. The lunar module had saved their lives. This fragile machine never meant to operate so far from the moon, pushed beyond its design limits, performing miracles. At 141 hours and 30 minutes, with 90 minutes until re-entry, Houston gave the order to jettison Aquarius, separating it before entering the atmosphere. The crew said goodbye to their lifeboat, this cramped, cold, miserable spacecraft that had been the difference between life and death for 3.5 days. Lovell, the last to leave Aquarius, looked around the cabin one final time, at the frost-covered walls, the improvised Code 2 scrubber still working, the instrument still glowing. He floated through the tunnel into Odyssey, and Swigert sealed the hatch behind him, locking it tight, preparing for the pyrotechnic separation. The explosive bolts fired, and springs pushed Aquarius away from Odyssey, separating the two spacecraft for the final time, ending their emergency partnership. Aquarius drifted away, tumbling slowly, still transmitting data to Houston, still functional, still serving until the atmosphere claimed it minutes later. Now they were alone in Odyssey, 3 men in a capsule 10 feet in diameter, falling toward Earth at 25,000 miles per hour, committed to re-entry. There was no abort option now, no backup plan, no alternative. They would either survive the next 30 minutes or die trying, and the outcome was still uncertain. The batteries showed adequate charge, but barely, with almost no margin for unexpected power draws or system failures during the critical re-entry phase. The heat shield, which had been cold-soaked for 3 days in space, had to withstand temperatures reaching 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit during atmospheric entry. Engineers worried that thermal shock might crack the heat shield, opening gaps where superheated plasma could burn through into the cabin, incinerating the crew. The parachute system, which had been frozen at near-zero temperatures, had to deploy perfectly in sequence or the capsule would impact the ocean at lethal velocity. At 142 hours and 38 minutes, Apollo 13 hit the entry interface, 100 miles above Earth where atmosphere begins affecting spacecraft. The spacecraft began slowing from 25,000 miles per hour, shedding velocity as kinetic energy converted to heat, the heat shield ablating away in controlled destruction. Outside the windows, plasma formed around the capsule, glowing orange and red, completely surrounding them in a sheath of superheated ionized gas. The plasma blocked radio transmissions completely, cutting off all communication with Earth, the crew again alone during the most dangerous 4 minutes of the mission. In mission control, the controllers counted down the expected blackout time, watching the clock, waiting for Apollo 13's signal to return, hoping the heat shield held. 3 minutes passed, 4 minutes. The expected blackout time expired, but no signal came from Apollo 13, only silence from the speakers, empty static. Apollo 13 Houston, the CAPCOM called into the void. Apollo 13 Houston, do you read? 20 seconds, 30 seconds, 45 seconds past expected acquisition of signal. Gene Kranz stared at his console, refusing to give up, refusing to believe failure. 1 minute past expected contact. The room held its breath collectively, hundreds of people motionless, the only sound the quiet hum of computers. Then breaking through the static, Swigert's voice. "Okay, Joe," speaking to CAPCOM Joe Kerwin, the signal weak but clear, the most beautiful sound ever heard. The room exploded in cheers, controllers jumping from their seats, hugging each other, 3 days of accumulated tension releasing in seconds of pure joy. Through the windows, the crew saw blue sky instead of plasma, saw clouds below them, saw the drogue parachutes deploy exactly on schedule above them. At 10,000 feet, the 3 main parachutes blossomed above Odyssey. orange and white canopies each spanning 83 feet in diameter, perfect deployment. The capsule swung beneath the parachutes like a pendulum, descending through clear Pacific sky toward an ocean surface sparkling in the morning sunlight. At 142 hours and 54 minutes after launch, Apollo 13 hit the Pacific Ocean with a tremendous splash, rolled briefly, then righted itself floating stable. Navy divers jumped from helicopters into the water, swimming to the capsule, securing flotation collars, preparing for crew extraction from their battered spacecraft. The hatch opened and Fred Haise emerged first, weak and sick, helped onto the rescue raft, followed by Jack Swigert, exhausted but smiling with relief. Jim Lovell came last, taking one final look at Odyssey before climbing out, this scorched and battered capsule that had carried them through the impossible. The helicopter lifted them to the USS Iwo Jima, where the carrier's crew gave them a hero's welcome, cheering as they landed on deck, home and safe. The astronauts were weak, dehydrated, Haise seriously ill, but they were alive, home, safe against all odds, having survived what should have been certain death. Apollo 13 became known as NASA's finest hour, not despite the failure but because of it, proving that no problem was unsolvable when brilliant minds refused to quit. The mission didn't reach the moon, but it achieved something greater. 3 men survived the impossible and came home, and that was the real victory. The investigation traced the accident to a ground test 2 years earlier, when faulty thermostatic switches allowed heaters to damage Oxygen Tank 2's internal wiring. NASA implemented dozens of safety changes, redesigned oxygen tanks, additional monitoring systems, improved testing procedures to prevent similar accidents from ever happening again. Apollo 14 launched 10 months later, with Alan Shepard's crew successfully landing at Fra Mauro, completing the science mission Apollo 13 never could. Jim Lovell never flew in space again, retiring after 4 missions with the distinction of orbiting the moon twice without landing on its surface. Fred Haise recovered from his kidney infection and continued with NASA, later commanding Space Shuttle landing tests before retiring from the astronaut program. Jack Swigert left NASA in 1973, entered politics, was elected to Congress from Colorado in 1982, but tragically died of cancer before taking office. Gene Kranz continued leading missions through Apollo, Skylab, and the Space Shuttle program, becoming a legendary figure in American space exploration history. Apollo 13 was classified as a successful failure, proving that human ingenuity, teamwork, and refusal to quit could overcome impossible odds and bring everyone home alive.